Olá a todos, bem-vindos a mais um Money Report Money Talks. Hoje nós vamos conversar com o historiador e cientista social Rainer Zitelmann, que está lançando esse livro aqui no Brasil. Em inglês ele se chama The Power of Capitalism. Aqui o capitalismo não é o problema, é a solução. Infelizmente essa conversa vai ser um pouco estendida e nós vamos fazê-la em inglês, mas vamos publicar um resumo depois em Money Report, na minha coluna, que é publicada diariamente. Então, vamos partir para a nossa conversa com o Dr. Rainer Zitelmann. Doctor, welcome to Money Report. Thank you very much for this interview. And we would like to move through your book, if you don't mind. But first of all, I'm curious about one thing. I read in your biography that you used to be a Maoist when you're young, like your fellow mate, Paul Breitner, the footballist. So how did you move?
Yes, exactly. Paul Breitner, yes, he had this Mao Bible. At this time, it was the same time. It was in the 70s. I was then admittedly very young. I was 13 years old, and I founded a Maoist group at my school called the Red Cell, and I edited a newspaper called the Red Banner. I was 13 years. Then as a teenager, I was Maoist. You're right. Our football player, Paul Breitner, was as well. And then it took maybe 10 years then. And when I started to study at the beginning of the 20s, step by step, I changed my opinions. But I think it happens very often that people, when they are very young, they started to be very as leftist, and later on they changed to more maybe liberal or conservative views.
Well, in the introduction of your book, you mentioned research. A poll made GlobeScan, and that they provided the following sentence: the free market and free commerce system and economy is the best system to build the future of the world. But in United Kingdom, only 19% of the interviewers agreed strongly. And then in Germany, this rate was 30%, and in France, only 6%. I'd like to listen to your opinion. What make people despise free economy concepts?
So first of all, another news that is maybe interesting for you. Some months ago, I commissioned myself a new poll. It was conducted by Ipsos Mori, that is one of the leading polling institutes in the world. And we did it in 19 countries, also in Brazil. It will be published in my next book that hopefully will be published by the end of the year in Brazil. But we asked people whether they are in favor of free market economy or not. And the result was that there were some countries, as United States, South Korea, Japan, also Argentina. What is very interesting, there were more people pro-free market than against free market, even in Argentina, but that was a big surprise for me. And then there were other countries where most people are against free market economy, and one of them was Chile. So you see a lot of things are changing now, even here in Latin America. Why is that? Especially, let's talk maybe about the example of Chile, because it is really hard to understand. They improved a lot according to all data, GDP per capita, and so in the last decades were very successful if you compare it with Argentina, even with Brazil, or with as well if you compare it with Venezuela, of course. And in spite of this fact, they voted for socialist candidates now. And this is a little bit hard to explain. Why is that? I think sometimes people forget why they were successful in their economy. If some decades they get used to it and they forget it, why they were successful. This is one reason. Another reason is that a lot of people don't know anything about history. Young people are pro-socialist. yes, they don't know anything about economics, don't know anything about history, and then they have their ideas like I had when I was young. So, but the last answer to the question is socialists are much better in communication and in public relation than capitalists. We should learn something from them.
Well, I couldn't agree more, especially in terms, not only in rational terms, but especially in the ability of touching people's hearts.
Yes.
Leftists are much better in this case, and with the arts, music, and movies. And on the other side, right wings, they tend to be very rational in their speeches. So it's very hard to convince young people, especially, right?
Yes, it is. But I were now 10 days in Argentina, and I met a lot of young people there, pro-capitalism, pro-free market. And I think they understood it a little bit better. Libertarians from, it's not only Milei, it's from different parties there in Argentina. For example, I met a young, very, very pretty woman there, Lilia, her name. She's like a actress and model, and she has this T-shirt, sexy T-shirt, pro-free market. So I think it surprised me very much that I met there a lot of young people who saw the solution for their problems like inflation or more capitalism. But this is an exception, of course. This is very rare. Maybe we can learn a little bit from people in Argentina in this way.
How do you see the rise of socialism ideas in US, for instance? This popularity that Bernie Sanders has among young people?
I think, yes, it is true. There are a lot of young people who supported him, but okay, finally he was not elected, but a more moderate one. I think it is anti-establishment, what I can understand, because were also anti-establishment, and they blame capitalism for all bad things that happen in the world, whether it's climate change, whether it's poverty. I think it's a kind of political religion. So what religion was in former centuries maybe is today something like socialism or anti-capitalism. They promise everything about the perfect society, and what they do, and I think this is really unfair, they compare real life world with a utopia or with a book. And it would be as fair as if I, for example, I compare your marriage, I don't know whether you're married, your marriage with a love novel. So your wife would come one day to you, oh, let's divorce. I read this love novel and everything's perfect. They kiss every morning. I compare it with our marriage, and so it's really bad. I think you would say that's not fair. Please compare our marriage with those of our friends, and then it's good, or maybe not as bad as you told me now. But this is what a lot of young people do. They have their utopia, their ideas of perfect society, a book, and they compare it with real life. And of course, a very important thing for the United States was people who are young today. I think their first experience was the financial crisis of 2008 and 2009. And according to the dominant explanation of this crisis, this was a crisis of capitalism. You have my book, you know, there's a chapter in my book where I explain why it was not a crisis of capitalism, on the contrary. But I think young people believe, and that was the first what they saw, oh, capitalism, as they saw it, doesn't work. And the financial crisis proves it. I think totally the other way around. It was a perfect example for failure of intervention of a central bank and of the state and of the government. But this is not the interpretation what people learn at school and what they learn when they read media. They learn at school a lot about the evils of, or so-called evils of capitalism, but nothing about evils of socialism. And I think this is a big, big problem, what they learn at school. I saw a poll in the United States at universities. And in the 70s, there were 3 leftist in relation to 2 conservative from professors. Today it's 12-1. So 12-1 at the universities. And I think it has a lot to do with our educational system and what they learn there at school, and especially what they not learn at school.
But when we talk about leftism in US, it's a little bit different than leftism in Europe or Brazil, right? Because they're much more, Democrats are considered leftists in US, but they're not exactly socialists, right?
It depends what you mean with socialism. If they speak about socialism, of course, they don't mean anything like in Soviet Union or this countries. No one want to have a system like this. No, they have always a new idea. This is a problem with socialists. They tried it at so many ways. There were more than 24 experiments in the last, in the 20th century, and everyone failed without any exception. They tried it in a different way in Russia than in China, in a different way in Chile and in Venezuela and in East Germany and in Korea and in Vietnam, but they failed all without any exception. But if you tell this to socialists, they tell you always, oh no, this was not real socialism, but now I have the idea how it can work. This was what happened. You remember 1999 when Hugo Chavez came to power. All the intellectuals in the world, especially in the United States, were so enthusiastic about socialism in the 21st century. And what happened after it failed? They told you, no, sorry, this wasn't real socialism, but I have another idea how it can work next time. And I think it's crazy. It's like, imagine a housewife who bakes a cake and the guests get sick from it. They have to vomit. Next week, she invites the same guests, and with a slight modification in the recipe, maybe some other ingredients, guests get sick again. The third week, she invites again guests, a little bit modification, guests get sick, and then they do it. She does it 24 times. Maybe you tell me this is a crazy example. There's no housewife in the world who would do something like this. That's true, but this is exactly what socialists do, to try the similar thing again and again and expect other results. That was Albert Einstein told us, to do things in the similar way and expect different results. It's absolutely a sign of being insane.
It's his definition of insanity, right?
Yes, exactly.
But the ideas of leftism, they're not only restricted to young people. And recently, we saw economists like Thomas Piketty launching books, and instead of crunching numbers, they tortured numbers in order to get his ideas, let's say, confirmed by statistics. Lots of other economists, they also they started to question the numbers that Piketty used in his books. And you mentioned that he says that there is a rise of the distance between poor and rich in terms of income and wealth from 1990 to 2010. But then you mentioned that at the same period, in China and India and other parts of the world, hundreds of millions of people escaped from extreme poverty. So how
yes.
can you explain this dichotomy, this difference of?
So yes, absolutely. So you are right. A lot of numbers from Piketty is wrong. There's a whole book, you can read it. It's called Anti-Piketty. And there you have a lot of facts why some numbers are wrong. But let me admit when his numbers would be right. And his main thesis is that inequality is rising. But first of all, according to his own numbers, he admits that this is not true for most of the 20th century. For most of the 20th century, inequality was reduced according to his numbers. Only what he tells us that 1990, the bad time started when inequality rise. But I give you one fact. 200 years ago, before capitalism, 90% of the worldwide population lived in extreme poverty. Today, it's less than 10%. But what's more important, half of this reduction happened during the last 35 years. So this means you had never a reduction in poverty as you had it in the last 35 years. And this is the bad time we're talking about. Let me give one example about China, because it has a lot to do with China. In China, in socialist times, end of the 50s, there was the so-called Great Leap Forward, the biggest socialist experiment in history. 45 million people died. People don't learn it at school. I have lectures all over the world, and I ask young people, have you heard about the Great Leap Forward where 45 million people died? No, we haven't heard about it at school. And then even 1981, 88% of people in China lived in extreme poverty, 88%. Today, it's less than 1%. Why? Because starting with Deng Xiaoping's reforms, they introduced private property, more market, more capitalism, and this was the reason for the reduction. So I was in China a lot of times, and I found no one who told us, oh, let's go back to Mao's time because we were more equal at this time. This would be a crazy idea. So what I mean, Thomas Piketty speaks about inequality. I speak about poverty. And I think this is much more important to speak about poverty. And the same years where he will tell us these are the very bad years because inequality was rising are exactly the years with the biggest reduction of poverty that happened in history. And so this is a question, I think the question of inequality is especially interesting for envious people who do not care about poverty, but is there something who's maybe richer as I am? And maybe let me add one last thing, what is important in this context. Anti-capitalists believe in zero-sum thinking. What do I mean with zero-sum thinking? They believe that rich people are only rich because they have taken something away from the poor. This is what they believe. But if you look at these numbers that I gave you from China, poverty was reduced from 88 to 1%, extreme poverty. At the same time, the number of billionaires increased from 0 because in socialist times in China, you had not a single billionaire to 700. Today, you have as many billionaires in China as in no other country in the world, only the United States, we have also 700. And even in Manhattan today, you have not so many billionaires as in Beijing. So you see, at the same time, the number of poor people decreased, the number of rich people increased. If zero-sum thinking would be correct, this couldn't happen. And this is my proof why zero-sum thinking is wrong.
The concept of socialism is something that is, it rises in the same around the same time of the Industrial Revolution. So perhaps we are talking about something that is, the perception is more related to this first years of capitalism with perhaps people without scruples and very aggressive industrial businessmen. Perhaps that's the image that stands until now in order to make people think that capitalism is evil.
Maybe, but even this is a legend. What even Friedrich Engels wrote in his famous book about the situation of working class there in the early days of capitalism in England. Today we know that it's wrong because the living conditions before capitalism started were not good. On the contrary, people were starvation, hunger, in poverty. A lot of people. In the view of socialists, before capitalism, this was maybe like a kind of a paradise, but it was really bad. And people at this time, you know, there was a lot of people going from the urban, from small villages to the big cities. But what was the reason? Because there was so much poverty, and they hoped for a better life in the cities and so. So what I mean, there are even a lot of legends about this, what they call this early stage of capitalism. Of course, the living conditions were worse than today, much worse than today. They had to work so long, but it was before, and it was worse before capitalism. And then it was changed. And how it was changed? It was changed because of capitalism, because capitalism developed, and you see it in every country in the world. I'll give you another example. We spoke about China. Let's speak about South Korea. I've been there in South Korea. In the 60s, it was one of the poorest countries in the world, as poor as many countries in Africa today. Today, I've been there. They have great shopping centers. People have a good living. You know, we buy their products, their TVs, their cell phones, and so on. Why is that? Because capitalism. And in North Korea, they have still this socialist system with starvation and with bad living conditions. And this is another thing that everyone should think about. Always people go in one direction, from socialism to capitalism. Or have you heard anytime, oh, I have to flee from evil capitalism South Korea to North Korea to have better living? Or no one went from maybe West Germany to East Germany, or maybe from, oh, I have to go now from Miami to Cuba. Yes, maybe for 2 weeks vacation, but not forever. So, and so it's always the same direction. People go from socialism to capitalism, never the other way around. There was no one who said, oh, I escaped this evil capitalism and now I'm so happy to live in socialism. This didn't happen.
Well, you mentioned the socialist experiences in DDR, in the
yes.
East Germany.
East Germany.
And also North Korea in your book. And I was wondering, is it possible to have communism without a dictatorship?
To have socialism without a dictatorship?
Yes.
I didn't get the question, so.
Do you think it's possible to have a communist regime without a dictatorship? People would choose
of course,
freely for that.
Communism is always dictatorship because people, they want to leave the country. It was what happened in East Germany. 2.7 million people escaped from East Germany to West Germany. And then they built the wall, and they told it's an anti-fascist wall to keep Western fascists out. But of course, it was a lie. It was a wall against their own people. And in North Korea, it's the same. But of course, there are examples of socialism without dictatorship. I have 2 chapters in my book. One is about Sweden in the 70s. And in Sweden in the 70s, it was a kind of what they call democratic socialism. And I agree it was a combination of democracy and socialism, but it failed, totally, it failed. And the Swedish people made a lot of reforms, then more market, they reduced taxes, they have high taxes today, but for example, they abolished wealth tax and abolished inheritance tax. They made a lot of pro-market reforms, then it became better. The same was in the UK. I have 1 chapter in my book about the so-called democratic socialism in the 70s in the UK. And it was absolutely a disaster. You can't imagine. This was an example of socialism, a kind of democratic socialism without dictatorship. But in the economies, they always failed without exceptions.
Well, I'd like to focus on this chapter on the UK. When you remember the song from the Beatles composed by George Harrison called Taxman. And let me tell you how it's going to be. It's 1 for you and 19 for me, which is incredible because this was the seed for them to create Apple, because they noticed that if their money were in a company, not as an individual, they would not be taxed so much. So I'd like to know, if this invention of the Labour Party, why the Tories, they bought it, why they kept it, why Churchill in this mandate, following mandate, why did he, which is a symbol of the free market, why did he keep that?
this is absolutely the best, I think, the most important topic to speak about, because I think the problems are not the socialists. So you have always the socialists and ideologists. The problems are you call them conservatives, or as well for businessmen and entrepreneurs. This is a problem that they do something like, I call it appeasement policy. They think if yes, some of your ideas are not so bad, and we have to take some of your ideas, and so they think they have the illusion that then. Please stop talking there. They have the illusion then. They have the illusion in this moment that things will become better, but it will be not. And I think this is the main problem, that entrepreneurs or people who are in opposition to socialists, they should be more offensive, not so defensive, not to have this appeasement policy. And they think if they adapt some of their ideas, then it's a good recipe against them, but it is not. And I think this is a big problem in a lot of countries, that they have not the, how to call it, the nuts, or that they are not courageous enough really to fight against them. I saw it now. This was a problem. I speak now a lot of Argentina because I've been there. This was the problem with the time of Macri there. I think he had some good ideas, but he didn't do a lot to fight against them. And this was the difference with Maggie Thatcher when she came, because she was the lady, but they called her the Iron Lady, because she really took the fights with the unions, for example, were very, very strong. And most of them, this is the difference between socialists and people who call themselves conservatives. The socialists always, they're very offensive, they stand their ground, they fight for it, and the others do not. And this is the biggest problem, not only at this time in the UK. I think it happens everywhere in the world.
Well, while in the UK, there was a necessity of being very tough, like Margaret Thatcher. In Sweden, as you mentioned in your book, it was a much more peaceful transformation, yes. Right? And especially
yes, you're right.
Especially in terms of tax reductions, and also in the way that the state move out from this protagonism. Why don't you tell us a little bit about it?
Yes, in Sweden it was really crazy. I give you one example so that it's not so abstract with their taxes. There's a famous book author, Astrid Lindgren. I don't know how you pronounce it here, but a lot of people know them for children's books. She was very famous in Sweden, and she was more like on the left, so she was social democrat. But one day she realized that she had to pay 102% taxes, 102% taxes. And she wrote an article in the most important Swedish newspaper, one page about this, she called it the tax fairy tale. And the finance minister said, it's wrong, you calculated wrong. This is not correct, 100% is wrong. But in the end, even the socialist prime minister, Olof Palme at this time, had to admit that she was right. It was correct, it was 102% that she had to pay. And this was not only for her. A lot of entrepreneurs, like IKEA founder, for example, Kamprad, they left Sweden at this time. First, he went to Denmark, but it wasn't better in Denmark. Then, in the end, he lived as the richest man in Switzerland. So, and then they realized it makes no sense when all the entrepreneurs and rich people leave our country. And then they started to change it. What did they do? Reduce taxes. Taxes are even very high today in these Nordic countries, but in a lot of other aspects, they are even more capitalist today in Sweden than the United States. A lot of people don't know it. They think even that Sweden is a kind of socialist state. This is wrong. It was in the 70s. I mentioned before, I think, the Index of Economic Freedom from Heritage Foundation. It's a ranking that is published every year. And in this ranking, you see how economic free are different countries. And if you look at this ranking today, Sweden is more capitalist than the United States and UK today. And so if socialists tell you, some socialists in the United States, oh, we have to adapt this Swedish socialism. No, forget it. It was 50 years ago. They saw that it's wrong. They changed it. Today, it's more capitalist than the United States. If you want to be a socialist like they are in Sweden, first abolish wealth tax, then abolish inheritance tax, and make labor market reforms, because these are the things that they did in Sweden.
Well, regarding South America, you mentioned in the end of the book about Brazil, and you have a very accurate analysis on what happened during Fernando Henrique Cardoso years up to Michel Temer. And then you say that it's a little bit earlier in order to evaluate what will happen after Bolsonaro's government, well, this first mandate at least. But you wrote that in last year. So now that we have 6 months ahead, can you tell us a little bit about your vision on this government and what he contribute to the free markets ideal?
Yes, to be precise, this chapter was not written by me. This is the only chapter someone else, because he's more expert in Brazil as I am. But of course, I can tell you a little bit because what happened after this. If you look, let's mention again the index of economic freedom, and you compare this year, 2022, and 5 years before, almost nothing changed. You have the same bad ranking in the index of economic freedom as before. I don't think that it's the whole truth, but I think you had some privatization, but not enough. You had some deregulation, but not enough. I think you didn't have tax reduction. So I think you have a very good Minister of Economy. I don't know how you pronounce it here, Guedes. Yes? Guedes. Sorry, I don't know how to pronounce Guedes. I think he's good, but he had not the majority in Parliament to go on with all his ideas. And so I think if I would favor something, that would be make Guedes, not Bolsonaro, to president and give him a majority in Parliament. And then I think things would turn to be better in Brazil. I think it will not happen, and I'm an outsider here. I don't want to get involved too much here in this, but I think that he had some good ideas, but only a few were realist. You know much more about it. Do you agree, or do you think I'm wrong in a way?
Well, it was a matter of, let's say, a lot of free market promises in the beginning of the government, and they were not fulfilled at all. So it's you can see a lot of good intentions, but as it happened in Argentina with Macri,
I would give the same comparison. It was the same with Macri. Macri, I think I will meet him here at or he will be at the same conference where I'm a speaker now. And I think he had a lot of good ideas, but he was not as tough as Maggie Thatcher. So I would tell them, be more like Maggie Thatcher was. You have to make real radical reforms, because if you do not, things will not change. And then we will lose the next election. This was happened with Macri. Why did he lose the election? Because people saw things don't going to change. And even if you make a radical cut, let's go back to Maggie Thatcher. Things became worse in the first 1 or 2 years. Of course, they will go worse, but then it will go better. This was the same with Ronald Reagan. It's not this way you make some reforms and next month everything is great. No, in a lot of times first things become worse. And you have to go through this hard times. I don't know whether people in Argentina or Brazil are patient enough for these 2 years, but you have to tell them the truth before you come to power. It's not this way. We have no secret recipe how to make everything's better. First, it will be blood, sweat, and tears, as Churchill said in the Second World War. It will be tough times, 1 year, 2 years. If you are not patient, please don't elect me because there is no possibility. And you should tell this to the people and then start immediately in the first year with all these reforms, reduce taxes, labor market reforms, privatization. And then hopefully after 3 or 4 years, when the next elections, we will see first results, hopefully. And then people will vote against for you. So if you have this soft policy with promising a lot and then doing little, I think it's a perfect recipe to lose the next election. Maggie Thatcher was elected 2 times. Ronald Reagan was elected 2 times.
And made his successor.
Pardon?
And he made his successor, George Bush Sr.
Yes.
Well, I'd like to finish with a question which is not related to your book, but I know that you are an expert on, which is the psychology of the super rich. You wrote another book about that, and I'd like to know if you see in the past few years some difference on behavior, especially after the pandemic. Did you see any changes on how the super rich think, act? Do you think they are in the middle of a transformation period?
Sometimes they claim that there is a change in the mentality. I don't think so. Look at the super rich people, look at the richest in the world, Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk. I think, of course, they have their luxury and so, but most they are concerned about and they work all over the day is their ideas and to realize for them, like going to Mars and conquer the space or doing their day-to-day business, like with Elon Musk, with his electric cars and so on. I think these are the most important things, their visions. And anything changed the pandemic way. What changed the pandemic is the valuation of their shares, but we don't know whether it's constantly, whether it comes back again. Now we have on all the shares at the Nasdaq are valuated very high, and this was partly, of course, due to the pandemic. With Amazon, it was clear that people could get all their products that they couldn't get in the pandemic in the supermarket. They got it with Amazon, and this was the reason why the share price of Amazon exploded in this time. And this was why he became richer than but it's true for everyone else who has shares in Amazon. The percentage was not in the absolute sum, but he became in the percentage as rich as richer as he became.
Okay, well, we are facing a difficult some technical difficulties. So I'm going to finish the interview, unfortunately, but I'm looking forward to meet you in person tomorrow at the conference, and I like to invite you in the next few months to do another interview with us to discuss a little bit about this psychology of the rich people. Okay, I'd like to extend this invitation.